Have you ever had a dream so vivid, so unsettling, that it left you questioning the very fabric of reality? Imagine waking up in a cold sweat, your heart pounding, only to realize that the nightmare didn't end when you opened your eyes. Today, I'm going to share with you a story that began in the quiet of the night, in the fragile space between sleep and consciousness. A story that blurs the line between what's real and what's imagined. But before we descend into this tale of dread, make sure to subscribe to the channel and hit that like button, because the stories I'm about to reveal aren't just ordinary tales. They're the kind that linger in the dark corners of your mind, the kind that make you question whether you'll ever truly wake up. It was a night like any other, or so it seemed. The kind of night where the silence is almost suffocating, where the darkness presses in from all sides, and the only sound is the distant ticking of a clock. But something felt off, like a heavy weight in the air that I couldn't quite place. As I drifted off to sleep, I felt an uneasy tension pulling at the edges of my mind, as if something was waiting for me just beyond the veil of dreams. Suddenly, I found myself standing in a place that was both familiar and completely alien. A crumbling mansion, hidden deep within an ancient forest. The air was thick with the smell of decay, and the trees outside seemed to whisper secrets in a language I couldn't understand. The mansion's walls were covered in a thick layer of dust, as if time itself had forgotten this place. Yet there was a strange pull, a force that beckoned me to step further inside, into the heart of darkness. As I moved through the shadowy halls, the sense of dread only grew. The silence was broken by the faintest of whispers, barely audible, but enough to make the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. I couldn't tell where they were coming from, maybe from the walls themselves, or from something unseen, lurking just out of sight. Each step I took echoed ominously, as if the mansion was alive, breathing in rhythm with my own panicked heartbeats. It was then that I noticed something strange. The shadows seemed to move on their own, stretching and twisting in unnatural ways, as if trying to reach out and pull me into their depths. My breath caught in my throat, and an icy chill ran down my spine. I wanted to turn back, to escape this place that felt like a living nightmare, but something compelled me to keep going. I had to know what was waiting for me in the darkness. Ahead of me, a door stood slightly ajar, a dim light seeping out from the crack. The light was strange, flickering and pulsing like it was alive, like it was calling out to me. My hand trembled as I reached for the door, the cold metal handle sending a jolt of fear through my body. I pushed it open, the creak of the hinges echoing through the empty halls, and stepped into the room. What I saw there froze me to the core. A figure stood in the center of the room, its back turned to me. It was tall and impossibly thin, draped in tattered black clothing that seemed to absorb the light. But what truly terrified me was the feeling that this was no ordinary person. This was something else, something ancient and malevolent. The air around it was heavy with a sense of impending doom, and I felt a primal fear grip my soul. The figure slowly began to turn, and I knew that if I saw its face, or whatever lay where a face should be, there would be no going back. My heart pounded in my chest. My legs felt like lead, and I knew that I was trapped. Trapped in this nightmare that was somehow more than a dream, a nightmare that I might never wake up from. But just before the figure completed its turn, I woke up. Or at least, I thought I did. The room was dark. The clock on my bedside table read 3:33 a.m., and my body was drenched in cold sweat. I could still feel the terror clawing at my chest, and the whispers from the mansion seemed to echo in the corners of my room. As I lay there, too afraid to move, one thought kept repeating in my mind. What if the nightmare didn't end? What if it's only just begun? If you've ever felt the icy grip of fear in the dead of night, then you know exactly what I'm talking about. Subscribe to the channel, leave a like, and brace yourself, because the stories I'll be sharing are not for the faint of heart. And remember, sometimes the most terrifying nightmares are the ones that follow you into the waking world. The night after that unsettling experience, Sleep did not come easily. My mind was a labyrinth of lingering fears and unanswered questions, yet exhaustion eventually pulled me under. As my eyes closed, I was instantly transported to a place shrouded in darkness and mystery. A dense ancient forest that seemed to stretch infinitely in all directions. The towering trees loomed overhead, their twisted branches intertwining to form a canopy that blocked out even the faintest hint of moonlight. A thick fog clung to the forest floor, swirling around my feet like ghostly tendrils, eager to pull me deeper into the unknown. The silence was deafening, interrupted only by the distant, haunting echoes of whispers that seemed to originate from the very shadows themselves. As I took my first hesitant steps into this ominous woodland, the air grew colder, each breath forming a fragile mist before dissipating into the darkness. The ground beneath me was uneven and damp, littered with decaying leaves and gnarled roots that threatened to trip me with every step. An overwhelming sense of being watched settled over me, prickling the back of my neck and sending shivers coursing down my spine. I couldn't shake the feeling that unseen eyes were tracking my every movement, hidden behind the veil of shadows and mist. Despite the mounting terror, an inexplicable force compelled me to venture further, drawing me deeper into the heart of this enigmatic forest. As I pressed on, the whispers grew louder and more distinct, morphing into incoherent murmurs that seemed to emanate from all around me. The voices overlapped in a cacophony of haunting tones, some pleading, others mocking, and some filled with a malevolence that made my blood run cold. Suddenly, a distant sound pierced the night, the snap of a branch echoing like a gunshot in the stillness. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest as I scanned the darkness for any sign of movement. For a moment all was silent once more, but then I caught a glimpse of something, or someone, darting between the trees, too quick and elusive to fully comprehend. The fleeting shadow left behind an oppressive dread, hinting that I was not alone in this forsaken place. Desperate to find a way out, I quickened my pace, navigating through the maze of trees and thick underbrush. The forest seemed to shift and change around me. Paths that once led forward now twisted back on themselves, trapping me in an endless loop of fear and confusion. The fog grew denser, obscuring my vision and distorting the shapes of the trees into grotesque figures that loomed and leered as I passed. My footsteps echoed strangely, as if the ground beneath me was hollow, and with each step, the sense of foreboding intensified. It was as though the forest itself was alive, intentionally manipulating and ensnaring me within its dark embrace. In the midst of this disorienting chaos, a faint, ethereal glow caught my eye through the thick veil of fog. Drawn by a mix of curiosity and desperation, I cautiously made my way toward the light, hoping it would lead to safety or at least provide some answers. As I approached, the glow resolved into the form of an old weathered lantern hanging from a crooked tree branch, its flickering flame casting eerie shadows that danced across the surrounding trees. Beneath the lantern stood an ancient moss-covered signpost with symbols and inscriptions that were impossible to decipher. The lantern swayed gently despite the still air, as if beckoning me closer while simultaneously warning me of the dangers that lay ahead. Just as I reached out to touch the lantern, a chilling gust of wind surged through the forest, extinguishing the flame and plunging everything back into darkness. The whispers around me escalated into anguished screams, and the once distant shadows began to close in, their forms becoming more tangible and threatening. Panic surged through me as I stumbled backward, trying to escape the encroaching darkness that sought to consume me. My breaths came in ragged gasps, and my heart thundered in my ears as the forest seemed to come alive with sinister intent. In that moment of sheer terror, I realized that this was no ordinary dream. It was a doorway to something far more real and terrifying than I could have ever imagined. As I ventured deeper into the dark heart of the forest, the tension tightened around me like a noose. Every sense was heightened, every sound magnified to a deafening pitch. The once distant whispers had now grown into a dissonant chorus of voices, overlapping in a maddening symphony of incoherent murmurs and sinister chants. They seemed to swirl around me, coming from every direction, as if the very trees were alive and possessed by malevolent spirits. My pulse raced, each beat echoing in my ears like a drum, drowning out all rational thought and leaving only the primal urge to flee. But there was nowhere to run. The forest was a labyrinth of shadows and twisted paths, each turn leading me further into the unknown. The air grew thicker, almost suffocating, as if the forest itself was alive, breathing with a dark, malevolent intent. The fog that had once swirled at my feet now rose like a living entity, wrapping around me, making it difficult to see more than a few feet ahead. Shapes moved within the mist, indistinct, shifting forms that seemed to melt into the shadows, only to reappear just beyond the corner of my vision. Were they real? Or was my mind playing tricks on me? I couldn't tell, and that uncertainty gnawed at my sanity. My footsteps, once steady, now faltered. The ground beneath me felt unstable, as if it could give way at any moment, plunging me into the depths of the earth. The trees, with their gnarled branches and twisted trunks, seemed to close in, their silhouettes distorted in the dim, flickering light of my dying lantern. Each creak of wood, each rustle of leaves, sent a jolt of terror through me. I felt as though I was being herded, guided by some unseen force toward an unknown destination. It was as if the forest itself had a will, a consciousness, and I was trespassing on sacred, forbidden ground. The oppressive silence was suddenly shattered by a low, guttural growl that seemed to reverberate through the very earth beneath my feet. It was a sound not of this world, deep and resonant, filled with an ancient hunger that made my blood run cold. My breath caught in my throat as I scanned the darkness, desperately trying to pinpoint the source of the noise. But the shadows were impenetrable, revealing nothing but the vague impression of something large and powerful moving just beyond the edge of my vision. The growl came again, closer this time, vibrating through my bones and sending a wave of icy dread through my body. Panicked, I began to run, my heart pounding as I stumbled through the undergrowth. Branches clawed at my skin, the fog thickened around me, and the whispers grew louder, more insistent. It felt as though the forest was alive, reaching out to ensnare me, to drag me deeper into its dark embrace. My breath came in ragged gasps, my legs burning with the effort of running. But no matter how fast I moved, I couldn't escape the feeling that something was right behind me. Something that moved with unnatural speed and silence. I could feel its presence, a cold, malevolent force that stalked me through the trees, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. In my blind terror, I tripped over a root, falling hard to the ground. The lantern slipped from my grasp, its flickering light extinguished as it hit the damp earth. Darkness closed in around me, thick and absolute, as I lay there, too stunned to move. For a moment, all was silent, save for the pounding of my heart in my ears. Then, from the darkness, I heard it, the sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate, crunching on the leaves and twigs as they drew closer. Each step was a countdown, a signal of my impending doom. With trembling hands, I reached out, desperately searching for the lantern, for any source of light to pierce the suffocating darkness. My fingers closed around the cold metal, and I fumbled to reignite the flame. But the footsteps were closer now, impossibly close, and I could feel the presence looming over me, its icy breath on the back of my neck. I dared not look up, too terrified of what I might see. The whispers had now turned into a low, guttural chanting, a language ancient and terrible, echoing in the depths of my mind. In that moment, the forest seemed to pulse with life, a dark, malevolent energy that surged through the ground beneath me. The shadows deepened, twisting and writhing as if they were alive, and the air grew colder, biting into my skin with a fierce, unnatural chill. I could feel the weight of 1,000 unseen eyes upon me, watching, waiting, as if the entire forest was holding its breath, anticipating the inevitable conclusion of this nightmarish game. My own breath was ragged and shallow, my body frozen in place by sheer terror. And then, just as I thought the darkness would consume me entirely, the footsteps stopped. The chanting ceased, leaving an oppressive silence that was somehow even more terrifying. The air was heavy with anticipation, as if the entire forest was waiting for something. Some final act in this terrifying play. I forced myself to move, to raise my head and look around. But there was nothing, only the suffocating darkness and the cold, unyielding fog that wrapped around me like a shroud. But I knew, deep in my soul, that whatever had been stalking me was still there, just beyond the edge of the light, watching, waiting. It hadn't gone away. It was simply waiting for the right moment to strike. I was no longer just a dreamer wandering through a nightmare. I was prey, lost in a dark, twisted world that defied all logic and reason, and the hunt was far from over. In the suffocating darkness of the forest, time seemed to stretch and warp, twisting reality into something unrecognizable. The silence that followed the footsteps was so thick, so absolute, that it felt like a physical presence pressing down on me. My heart pounded in my chest, a frantic rhythm that seemed to echo through the trees, reverberating in the eerie stillness. I could feel it, the malevolent presence that had been stalking me, lurking just beyond the veil of shadows, biding its time. The air was heavy with the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves, mingled with something far more foul, a stench that clung to the back of my throat like rot and death. Suddenly, the silence was shattered by a sound that made my blood run cold, a low, rasping breath, as if something monstrous was drawing in air through ruined lungs. It came from behind me, so close that I could feel the chill of its exhale against the nape of my neck. Every muscle in my body tensed with terror, the primal instinct to flee screaming through my mind, but my legs refused to move. I was paralyzed, caught in the grip of a fear so profound that it locked me in place, a helpless witness to whatever horror was about to unfold. Slowly, agonizingly slowly, I forced myself to turn around. The darkness seemed to ripple and shift, parting just enough to reveal a figure standing only a few feet away. It was tall and impossibly thin, its form draped in tattered, shadowy robes that seemed to absorb all light. But what truly terrified me was its face, or rather the absence of one. Where eyes, nose, and mouth should have been, there was only a void, a swirling abyss of darkness that defied comprehension. It was as if the figure was a physical embodiment of the void itself, an entity born from the darkest nightmares, something that had no right to exist in the world of the living. My breath caught in my throat, and for a moment, I couldn't look away. The void where its face should have been seemed to draw me in, pulling at the edges of my sanity, threatening to consume me entirely. I could feel the weight of its gaze, or whatever it used to perceive the world, boring into me, probing the deepest recesses of my mind, my fears, my very soul. The air around us grew colder, and the shadows began to twist and writhe as if they were alive, reacting to the presence of this abomination. Suddenly, the figure began to move. It took a slow, deliberate step toward me, the ground beneath it seeming to decay and rot with each step it took. The whispers that had surrounded me throughout this nightmare grew louder, more frantic, as if they were warning me, begging me to run. But I was rooted to the spot, unable to tear my gaze away from the figure as it drew closer, the darkness around it deepening, spreading like a stain through the fog. Desperation surged through me. I tried to scream, to cry out for help, but my voice was trapped in my throat, choked by the overwhelming terror. The figure was almost upon me now, its presence so overwhelming that it seemed to distort the very fabric of reality. The air was thick with an unnatural pressure, making it hard to breathe, hard to think. I could feel it pulling at me, tugging me toward that void, that endless abyss that seemed to promise an eternity of darkness and despair. In a final desperate act, I squeezed my eyes shut, hoping, praying that this was still just a nightmare, that I could wake up and escape this living hell. But even with my eyes closed, I could still feel it, that oppressive darkness pressing in on me from all sides, and the cold breath of the faceless figure against my skin. My heart pounded in my ears, each beat a frantic plea for escape, for salvation. And then, in a heartbeat, everything changed. When I dared to open my eyes again, I found myself lying in my bed, drenched in sweat, my sheets tangled around me. The room was dark, the only light coming from the faint glow of the clock on my bedside table, which read 3:33 a.m. My breath came in ragged gasps, my heart still racing from the terror that had gripped me so completely. But something was wrong. The room was too quiet, too still, as if the world itself was holding its breath. And then I heard it, the sound that confirmed my worst fears. A whisper, faint but unmistakable, drifting through the darkness of my room. It was the same whisper I had heard in the forest, the same voice that had haunted my every step in that nightmare. My blood turned to ice as the realization hit me with crushing force. I hadn't escaped. The nightmare hadn't ended. It had followed me, crossing the boundary between dreams and reality. The whisper grew louder, more insistent, as if it was trying to convey some message, some dark secret that I was never meant to know. I tried to move, to get out of bed, but my body refused to obey. It was as if I was still trapped in the nightmare, unable to break free from its grip. The shadows in the room seemed to shift and writhe, taking on shapes that defied logic, shapes that resembled the figure from my dream. Then, from the corner of my eye, I saw it, a dark silhouette standing in the doorway, shrouded in shadow. The figure was back, no longer confined to the world of dreams, but standing in my bedroom, its presence more real and terrifying than ever. The void where its face should have been seemed to pulse with a dark energy, drawing all light and warmth from the room. The temperature dropped, and I could see my breath fogging in the cold air as the figure began to move toward me once more. My heart raced, my mind screamed in terror, but I was powerless to stop it. The figure loomed over me, the shadows closing in, and I knew that this time there would be no waking up. Whatever this entity was, it had crossed over into my world, and it wasn't going to leave until it had taken me with it. As the figure reached out with a hand cloaked in darkness, I felt a cold, icy grip around my throat. The room began to spin, the shadows closing in from all sides, and the last thing I saw before everything went black was the void where the figure's face should have been. A void that seemed to promise an eternity of suffering and despair. When I finally regained consciousness, I was no longer in my bedroom. I awoke on a cold, hard surface, the scent of damp earth and mildew filling my nostrils. My body ached as if I had been dragged through miles of rough terrain, and my head throbbed with a dull, relentless pain. Blinking against the oppressive darkness, I struggled to make sense of my surroundings. The dim light barely revealed the crumbling walls of what seemed to be an old, abandoned basement. The air was thick with decay, and the silence was broken only by the occasional drip of water echoing from somewhere deep within the structure. Panic surged through me as I realized I had no memory of how I got here. The last thing I remembered was the faceless figure looming over me in my bedroom, its cold grip tightening around my throat. How had I ended up in this place? Was I still dreaming? Or had the nightmare somehow become my reality? My mind raced with questions, each one more terrifying than the last. Forcing myself to stand, I stumbled forward, my legs shaky and weak. The room was small and windowless, with only a narrow staircase leading upward, the steps old and creaking underfoot. As I ascended, the sense of dread grew stronger, as if each step was leading me closer to some unspeakable truth. The stairs led to a heavy wooden door, its surface scarred and weathered by time. My hand trembled as I reached for the rusted handle, dread filling every corner of my being. With a deep breath, I pushed the door open. It creaked ominously, revealing a long, narrow hallway lined with more decaying walls. The air was even colder here, and the shadows seemed to cling to every surface, as if they were alive. As I stepped into the hallway, a sense of déjà vu washed over me, a chilling realization that I had seen this place before, in my dreams. Every detail was identical, from the peeling wallpaper to the flickering light bulbs hanging precariously from the ceiling. This was the same place that had haunted my nightmares, the place where the faceless figure had first appeared. I continued down the hallway, my heart pounding in my chest. The whispers returned, faint at first but growing louder with each step I took. They seemed to be guiding me, leading me deeper into the bowels of this forsaken place. The air grew thicker, the atmosphere heavy with an unseen presence that made my skin crawl. I could feel the weight of 1,000 unseen eyes watching me, judging me, as I moved closer to the end of the hallway. Finally, I reached a door at the end of the corridor. Unlike the others, this door was pristine, untouched by the decay that plagued the rest of the building. It was as if it had been preserved by some dark force, waiting for me to arrive. My hand hovered over the handle, fear gripping me like a vice, but I knew I had to open it. I had to know what lay beyond. The door swung open with a loud creak, revealing a room bathed in an unnatural light. The source of the light was a single old-fashioned lamp sitting on a dusty table in the center of the room. But it wasn't the light that caught my attention. It was what was laid out on the table. A collection of old, yellowed photographs, each one showing the same figure, the faceless entity that had haunted my dreams. I stepped closer, my breath catching in my throat as I studied the photos. In each one, the figure was depicted in various locations, some of which I recognized from my dreams, others from places I had visited in reality. But the most disturbing part was that the figure wasn't always alone. In some of the photos, there were other people, men, women, even children, standing beside the figure, their expressions vacant, their eyes empty. They looked as though they were in a trance, unaware of the horror standing next to them. I felt a chill run down my spine as I realized that these people were likely the ones who had disappeared, victims of the faceless entity that now seemed to have a hold on me. As I sifted through the photographs, something even more terrifying caught my eye. A journal lay beside the photos, its pages filled with frantic, scrawled handwriting. The entries were dated, some going back decades, others only months or weeks. The journal chronicled the experiences of those who had encountered the faceless figure, each story more horrifying than the last. The final entry, however, was the one that froze the blood in my veins. It was dated the night before, the night I had first encountered the figure in my dreams. The entry described, in harrowing detail, everything I had experienced: the dream, the forest, the figure, and finally, waking up in this very basement. It was as if someone or something had been watching me, documenting my every move, every thought. A wave of nausea washed over me as the reality of my situation sank in. This was no coincidence. I had been lured here, guided by forces beyond my understanding, to face whatever dark fate awaited me. The whispers around me grew louder, more insistent, as if they were urging me to continue, to uncover the final piece of this terrifying puzzle. As I turned the last page of the journal, a single word was scrawled in bold, uneven letters: run. Suddenly, the whispers stopped, and a deafening silence fell over the room. The air grew colder, the shadows darker, and I felt the presence of the faceless figure behind me once more. It was closer than ever, its void-like face hovering just inches from the back of my head. My body trembled with fear, my mind screaming at me to flee, to escape this place before it was too late. But it was already too late. The room began to spin, the shadows closing in, and the last thing I saw before everything went black was my own reflection in the faceless void. My face, my features, slowly being consumed by the darkness. When I regained consciousness again, the first thing I noticed was the suffocating darkness. It was different from before, thicker, more oppressive, as if the shadows had become a physical force pressing in on me from all sides. My body ached, every muscle screaming in protest as I tried to move, but the weight of fear kept me pinned to the cold, unforgiving ground. The air was frigid, each breath a painful reminder that I was still alive, still trapped in this nightmare that had become my reality. The silence was absolute, broken only by the faint, rhythmic pounding of my heart in my ears. For a moment, I wondered if I was dead, lost in some purgatorial void where time and space no longer held meaning. But then I heard it, a faint, distant sound that sent a jolt of terror through my veins. It was a soft, almost imperceptible scraping, like nails being dragged across stone. The sound was rhythmic, deliberate, growing louder with each passing second, echoing through the darkness as it drew closer. Desperation clawed at my mind as I forced myself to sit up. Every movement a struggle against the crushing weight of fear. I had to get out of here. Had to escape this place before whatever was coming found me. But as I looked around, I realized with mounting horror that I had no idea where I was. The basement, the hallway, the room with the photographs. It was all gone, replaced by an endless void of shadow and darkness. There were no walls, no doors, no landmarks of any kind. It was as if I had been transported to another dimension, a place where light and hope did not exist. The scraping sound grew louder, closer, and with it came a low, guttural growl that seemed to vibrate through the very ground beneath me. My heart raced, my breath coming in shallow, panicked gasps as I scrambled to my feet. I had to move, had to run, but there was nowhere to go. The darkness was endless, impenetrable, and I could feel the presence of something malevolent lurking just beyond the edge of my vision, waiting for the right moment to strike. In a blind panic, I began to run, my footsteps echoing in the void as I sprinted through the darkness. The growling grew louder, the scraping more frenzied, as if whatever was chasing me was gaining ground, closing in for the kill. I could feel its breath on the back of my neck, cold and fetid, and the shadows seemed to ripple and twist as it moved through them, hunting me with a relentless, predatory hunger. But no matter how fast I ran, I couldn't escape. The darkness was everywhere, closing in around me, suffocating me, and the sounds of pursuit only grew louder, more intense. My legs burned with the effort. My lungs felt like they were on fire, but I couldn't stop. I knew that if I did, if I slowed down, even for a moment, it would be the end. As I ran, the darkness began to change. Faint, ghostly shapes started to materialize around me. Distorted, twisted figures that seemed to emerge from the shadows themselves. They were human-like, but wrong, their forms warped and elongated, their faces contorted into expressions of pain and anguish. Their eyes were hollow, empty voids that stared at me with a malevolence that made my skin crawl. They reached out for me with skeletal hands, their fingers claw-like and covered in rotting flesh, but they never quite touched me, always just out of reach. The air grew colder with each passing moment, the temperature dropping to an unbearable chill that seeped into my bones. The figures in the darkness grew more numerous, their whispers a cacophony of despair and torment that filled my mind, drowning out all rational thought. Their voices overlapped, forming a dissonant chorus that seemed to come from all directions, as if they were surrounding me, closing in, preparing to drag me down into whatever hellish pit they had come from. Just when I thought I could run no more, that my body would give out from sheer exhaustion, I saw it, a faint flickering light in the distance. It was weak, barely more than a pinprick in the vast sea of darkness, but it was there, a beacon of hope in an otherwise hopeless situation. With every ounce of strength I had left, I forced myself toward it, the light growing brighter with each step I took. But the closer I got, the more the light revealed the true nature of my surroundings. The ground beneath me was no longer solid earth, but a shifting, seething mass of something dark and organic, like the surface of a rotting corpse. The figures in the darkness became more distinct, their forms more grotesque and horrifying, their faces twisted into masks of rage and sorrow. They were trapped here, I realized, just as I was, lost souls condemned to wander this dark, forsaken place for eternity. The light grew brighter, more intense, until it was almost blinding. I could see now that it was coming from a doorway, a single solitary portal standing in the midst of the darkness, its frame lined with strange, pulsating symbols that seemed to writhe and twist as I approached. The door itself was made of some ancient weathered wood, its surface covered in deep, jagged scratches as if something had tried, and failed, to claw its way through. Desperation drove me forward, my mind screaming at me to reach the door, to escape this place before it was too late. But as I drew nearer, the growling behind me intensified, and I knew that whatever had been chasing me was right on my heels, ready to strike. The figures in the darkness wailed in unison, their cries a symphony of despair that echoed through my very soul, urging me to run faster, to reach the door before it closed forever. I was only a few steps away when the ground beneath me began to give way, crumbling into a gaping chasm of darkness that yawned open like the maw of some monstrous beast. The door loomed just ahead, so close yet so far, and I knew that if I didn't reach it in time, I would be swallowed whole, lost to the darkness forever. With a final desperate burst of energy, I lunged forward, my fingers brushing against the cold wood of the door just as the ground beneath me crumbled completely. I felt the void pulling at me, dragging me down, but I refused to let go. With a strength I didn't know I possessed, I pulled myself through the doorway, the darkness closing in behind me with a deafening roar. For a moment, I was weightless, suspended in a void of light and darkness, time and space losing all meaning. And then, with a jarring thud, I was back on solid ground, the door slamming shut behind me with a finality that echoed through the still air. I lay there for a moment, gasping for breath, my heart racing as I tried to process what had just happened. The light around me was soft, warm, a stark contrast to the cold, oppressive darkness I had just escaped. Slowly, I forced myself to sit up, my eyes adjusting to the dim light. But as I looked around, my heart sank. I was in the same hallway, the same room, the same forsaken place I had just fled. The light was coming from the same old lantern, hanging from the same crooked tree branch. The shadows still writhed on the walls, the whispers still echoed in the air, and the presence of the faceless figure was stronger than ever. I hadn't escaped. I had only gone deeper into the nightmare, and I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to the bone, that there was no way out. As I stood in that cursed hallway, my breath ragged and my body trembling with exhaustion, I realized with a cold, sinking dread that there was no escape from this nightmare. The light that had guided me here flickered ominously, casting long, twisted shadows on the walls that seemed to pulse with a life of their own. The air was thick with the scent of decay and something far more ancient, a foul odor that clung to the back of my throat like the memory of something long dead. The oppressive silence pressed down on me, broken only by the faint, rhythmic tapping of something unseen, echoing through the corridor like a death knell. I knew I couldn't stay there. Whatever force had brought me to this place was still lurking in the shadows, watching, waiting for me to make the next move. With each passing second, the presence grew stronger, more palpable, as if it were drawing power from my fear, feeding on it. I could feel it pressing in on me from all sides, a cold, suffocating weight that made it hard to breathe, hard to think. My heart pounded in my chest, the frantic rhythm matching the frantic thoughts racing through my mind. I had to keep moving, had to find a way out before it was too late. With trembling hands, I reached for the door at the end of the hallway. It was the same door that had drawn me in before, with its pristine surface untouched by the decay that plagued the rest of the building. But now, as I reached out to touch it, the wood felt cold and unyielding, like the surface of a gravestone. The strange, pulsating symbols etched into its surface seemed to writhe beneath my fingertips, as if they were alive, reacting to my touch. A shiver ran down my spine as I felt the presence of the faceless figure growing stronger, closer. I pushed the door open, the creak of the hinges echoing through the corridor like a scream in the dark. The room beyond was shrouded in shadows, but I could see the faint outline of a figure standing in the center, waiting for me. The air was thick with tension, the kind that makes your skin prickle with unease, as if the very fabric of reality was holding its breath, waiting for the inevitable. My legs felt like lead as I stepped into the room, the door closing behind me with a heavy thud that reverberated through my bones. The figure in the center of the room was tall and impossibly thin, its form draped in tattered, shadowy robes that seemed to absorb all light. It was the same figure from my dreams, the same faceless entity that had haunted my every step since this nightmare began. But now, it was no longer just a distant, shadowy presence. It was real, standing before me in all its terrible glory. The void where its face should have been was a swirling abyss of darkness, a black hole that seemed to suck in all light and warmth, leaving only cold, empty despair in its wake. For a moment, we stood there in silence, the air between us heavy with unspoken dread. I could feel its gaze, or whatever it used to perceive the world, boring into me, probing the deepest recesses of my mind, my soul. The room around us seemed to pulse with a dark energy, the shadows on the walls writhing and twisting as if they were alive, reacting to the presence of this ancient, malevolent force. Suddenly, the silence was shattered by a voice that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere all at once. It was a low, guttural sound, like the rasping breath of something long dead, and it spoke in a language I couldn't understand, a language that was as old as time itself. The words seemed to crawl into my mind, seeping into my thoughts like a poison, filling me with a terror so profound that it felt like my very soul was being ripped apart. I tried to move, to speak, to do anything, but my body refused to obey. It was as if I had been frozen in place, held captive by the sheer force of the entity's will. The figure began to move toward me, its steps slow and deliberate, each one sending a jolt of fear through my already shattered nerves. The air grew colder with each step it took, the temperature dropping to a point where I could see my breath fogging in the air. The shadows on the walls seemed to close in around me, pressing in on me from all sides, leaving no room for escape. As the figure drew closer, the void where its face should have been began to shift, the darkness swirling and coalescing into something even more terrifying. I could see faint outlines of features forming in the void, eyes, a mouth, but twisted, grotesque, as if the figure was trying to mimic a human face but failing in the most horrifying way possible. The eyes were empty pits, voids within voids, and the mouth was a gaping maw that seemed to stretch impossibly wide, filled with darkness so deep it felt like it could swallow the world whole. When the figure was only inches away, it stopped, the void where its face should have been hovering just above mine. The cold, fetid breath washed over me, and I could feel the darkness pressing in on me, wrapping around me like a shroud. The voice came again, louder this time, more insistent, the words dripping with malice and ancient power. I felt my mind begin to unravel, my thoughts scattering like leaves in a storm as the entity's influence took hold. In a final, desperate act of defiance, I forced my hand into my pocket, where I had stashed the journal I'd found earlier. With a trembling hand, I pulled it out and thrust it toward the figure, hoping against hope that it would have some effect. The figure paused, the void where its face should have been shifting as it seemed to regard the journal with something akin to recognition. The shadows on the walls stilled, the oppressive air around me easing just slightly. For a moment, I dared to hope that I had found a way to break the entity's hold on me, but that hope was short-lived. The figure reached out with a hand cloaked in darkness, its fingers impossibly long and thin, and took the journal from me. As it did, the symbols on the cover began to glow with a sickly, unnatural light. The same pulsating glow that had lined the doorway. The figure seemed to absorb the light. The void where its face should have been growing darker, more menacing. And then with a final, earth-shattering roar, the figure opened its maw, and the darkness within it surged forward, enveloping me completely. The last thing I saw before the world went black was my own reflection in the void, twisted, distorted, and consumed by the darkness. When the darkness finally receded, I found myself back in the basement where this nightmare had begun. The room was silent, the oppressive atmosphere gone, but the memory of what had just happened lingered in the air, like a bad dream. The figure was gone, the journal lying on the floor where it had dropped, the symbols on its cover now dark and lifeless. But as I picked up the journal, I knew that the nightmare was far from over. The entity had left its mark on me, a dark stain on my soul that I would never be able to wash away. And I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to the bone, that it was only a matter of time before it returned. The darkness was waiting, lurking just beyond the edge of reality, ready to pull me back into its depths at the slightest provocation. I had escaped for now, but I was not free. The entity was still out there, and it was only a matter of time before it came for me again. The only question that remained was when. When I awoke, it was to a world drenched in an unsettling calm. The basement where I found myself was the same as before, yet it felt different, as if the air itself had thickened with a malevolent energy that lingered just beyond the edge of perception. The oppressive darkness that had once consumed me was now replaced by a dim, grayish light filtering in from an unseen source, casting eerie, elongated shadows that danced across the decaying walls. The air was damp, carrying with it the faint scent of rot and mildew, a reminder of the nightmare I had just endured, or perhaps was still enduring. My body was exhausted, drained of all strength, but my mind was racing, trying to make sense of what had just happened. The journal lay on the cold stone floor beside me, its cover still marked with the strange pulsating symbols that had seemed to react to the entity. But now the symbols were dormant, lifeless, as if whatever power they had once held had been spent, or worse, had transferred to something else, something far more sinister. As I struggled to my feet, every muscle in my body protested, aching from the ordeal. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that the entity was still with me, lurking in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to strike again. The silence was unnerving, so absolute that it made the slightest sound. My own breathing, the creak of the floorboards beneath my feet, seemed unnaturally loud. It was as if the very air was holding its breath, waiting for something terrible to happen. But nothing did. The minutes ticked by, each one stretching into what felt like an eternity, and still, nothing happened. The oppressive weight of the entity's presence seemed to have lifted, but I knew better than to trust this sudden calm. I knew that it was still out there, waiting, watching. This was no ordinary basement. It was a gateway, a threshold between worlds, and I had crossed it. Whatever dark force had brought me here was not done with me yet. I picked up the journal, my hands trembling as I turned it over in my hands. The pages were yellowed and brittle, filled with the frantic scrawl of the previous victims, people who, like me, had encountered the faceless entity and had been drawn into its dark web. Each entry told a story of terror, of nightmares made real, of desperate attempts to escape the inescapable, and each one ended the same way, with the writer's sudden disappearance, leaving behind only this journal as a testament to their final, futile struggle. As I flipped through the pages, my heart pounding in my chest, I came across an entry that sent a chill down my spine. It was dated just a few days before my own encounter, and it described in detail the same dream I had, right down to the faceless figure, the suffocating darkness, the endless forest. But the most chilling part was the final line, scrawled in large, jagged letters across the bottom of the page. "It's coming for you next." My blood ran cold as the realization hit me with the force of a sledgehammer. The entity wasn't done with me. It had only begun its hunt. The journal wasn't just a record of past encounters. It was a warning, a prophecy of what was to come. The people who had written in it had all disappeared, swallowed by the darkness. And now it was my turn. The entity had marked me, and no matter where I went, it would follow. There was no escaping it. The whispers returned, faint at first, but growing louder, more insistent. They seemed to come from the walls themselves, from the very air around me, a chorus of voices, each one filled with a cold, malevolent hunger. They were different from before, no longer just a backdrop to the horror, but a part of it, an extension of the entity's will. They called my name, taunting me, urging me to give in, to surrender to the darkness. Desperation clawed at my mind as I realized that I had no options left. I could run, but where would I go? The entity would follow, would find me no matter where I tried to hide. The darkness was not just a physical place. It was a state of being, a curse that had been placed upon me, and there was no escaping it. I was trapped in a nightmare that had no end, a nightmare that would continue to haunt me, to torment me, until it finally consumed me. But there was one thing I could do, one last act of defiance, before the darkness claimed me. I could leave a warning for whoever found the journal next, a message to let them know what was coming, to prepare them for the terror that awaited them. With trembling hands, I reached for the pen that had been left by the last victim and began to write. My words were hurried, frantic, as I tried to convey the horror of what I had experienced, the terror that still gripped me. I told them everything about the faceless entity, the nightmares, the basement, the whispers. I warned them not to trust the calm, to never let their guard down, because the entity was always watching, always waiting. I told them that once they had been marked, there was no escape, no way out. The darkness would find them, just as it had found me. And then, just as I finished writing, I heard it. The sound that I had been dreading, the sound that signaled the end. It was the same low, guttural growl that had haunted my nightmares. The sound of something ancient and malevolent, something that was drawing ever closer. The whispers grew louder, more frantic, and the shadows in the room began to shift, to twist and writhe as if they were alive. My heart pounded in my chest as I realized that the entity was here, in the room with me. The calm was over. The hunt had begun. I dropped the pen and stood, my legs shaking as the darkness closed in around me. I could feel it, the cold breath of the entity on the back of my neck, the weight of its gaze as it watched me from the shadows. I knew what was coming, but I wasn't ready. I would never be ready. The whispers reached a crescendo, the shadows converging on me, and in that final terrifying moment, I knew that there was no escape. The entity had found me, and there was nothing I could do to stop it. The darkness was all-consuming, a void that swallowed everything in its path, and as it closed in, I felt myself being pulled into it, into the endless, suffocating black.